Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Habari Gani, this is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Malcolm X weekend, May 20th, 2023. First, we make a note of the transition to the ancestor world of Jim Brown, civil rights activist, legendary pro footballer, Hall of Fame running back, and actor, who passed at the age of 87 in Los Angeles. Our condolences to all his relations. Today, our central theme is imperialism in Africa historically. This hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews David Vine, professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C., and author of the book, The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State. Then, later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Marco Wyss, director of the Center for War and Diplomacy, and professor in International History and Security at Lancaster University in the UK, and author of the book Postcolonial Security, Britain, France, and West Africa's Cold War. We also want to remind our listening audience that today, until 7 p.m. happening now, a reminder to attend the 18th annual Malcolm X Festival at the Leimert Park Black Arts Village. This event is being held by Family, FAMLI, under the direction of Mr. Taurus Brandon Reese, a longtime visionary and advocate in the Los Angeles community. This year's theme is Human Rights, a Vision and Strategy for Our Future. In addition to the festival and accompanying symposium, they're celebrating the historic dedication of a 5-mile segment of Crenshaw Boulevard in honor of the iconic civil and human rights leader, Minister Alhaj Malik Al-Shabazz, Malcolm X. This is happening at Leimert Park Village, People Street, 3333 West 43rd Place, LA 90008, happening now until 7 p.m. You can contact Mr. Taurus Brandon Reese at 323-245-2133. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, George Benson, Steve Davis, Hank Mobley, McCoy Tyner, John Coltrane, and Sampa the Great. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is David Vine, professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C., and author of the book, The United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, David Vine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horne. Gerald, it's a pleasure to be with you.
and it's a pleasure to have you. So why did you produce this book, The United States of War?
There are many ways to answer that question, but I think first and foremost was just experiencing the last now 21 plus years of war, the post 9/11 wars, and being, to put it lightly, outraged, dismayed, appalled, saddened, profoundly saddened by the absolute catastrophic destruction that our country has wreaked on Afghanistan, Iraq, countries far beyond, the entire Middle East, and wanting to understand something about this period of war that initially, when I looked at, the post 9/11 wars that have been so formative to my life and to many lives, I thought it was somehow aberrational that, the United States has been fighting wars constantly since 2001. And, now more than 1 in every 4 people in the United States hasn't lived a day on earth when the United States wasn't at war. And I wanted to understand this pattern of war. And I didn't want to just understand for understanding's sake, but I wanted to understand and write about my findings in a way that might be useful for stopping this pattern of war, for transforming the United States from what I describe as the United States of war into something that might look more like a United States of peace, which I think is possible. It might sound sort of utopian, but I think that's what our aim must be, given what I show in the book is a much longer pattern of war that really dates to independence, and as the subtitle of the book shows, dates to before the United States existed, dates to at least the arrival of Columbus in the Western Hemisphere and European imperialism that preceded the rise of U.S. imperialism.
So speaking of the subtitle of your book, it's easy to infer from the subtitle that the United States has been involved in so many wars because, in no small measure, it was a state based upon an invasion of a territory controlled by the indigenous and uprooting them from their land. And that helps to create a culture that leads to what we're encountering today. But what say you in terms of answering the question of why the United States has been involved in so many wars?
I think that the history of the United States arising out of European empires, arising out of the history of European imperialism in the Americas in particular, context in which you have competing empires, the British, French, Spanish especially, and others. And the United States arises and wins its independence from the British Empire and is led by a group of white male elites who quite consciously, while rebelling against the British Empire, also modeled the United States in many ways after the European empires and saw themselves as a rising American empire. The language of empire and imperialism, of course, wasn't a language that was shied away from. In fact, it was the model. And you see the United States expanding almost immediately after gaining its formal independence. And in the book, I show how if you look at U.S. military bases and the growth and expansion of U.S. military bases abroad meaning on the lands of Native American peoples, you can see the way in which the U.S. empire grows initially in North America, crossing the entire North American continent, colonizing millions of peoples, and of course, in a process that led to the deaths and displacement of millions upon millions of Native Americans, as well as countless injuries and the trauma and societal destruction that U.S. colonization wreaked. I tend to focus on this imperial history and the economic, especially, and to some lesser extent, the political dynamics that fueled this growth of U.S. imperialism. That the growth of U.S. empire, of the boundaries of the United States, of U.S. military activity and U.S. wars, didn't just happen on their own. They were always a tool advancing capitalist interests, specific business interests as well as the interests of land speculators, traders of many kinds. And this is a pattern that, of course, continues far beyond the conquest of continental lands in North America, and extends to islands outside of North America with the 1898 war with Spain. And then the United States, across the 20th century and into the 21st century, becomes a truly global empire, especially, of course, during World War II, an empire defined less by the collection and conquest of individual colonies and defined increasingly after World War II by a huge collection of military bases abroad. Again, the collection of bases abroad dates to independence, initially on Native American peoples' lands, but in the 20th and 21st century, we see the United States acquiring and building and expanding bases around the globe. Currently, the U.S. military has around 750 military bases abroad, and this is a larger collection than any country, people, or empire in world history. And at times, the United States has had far more in the heights of World War II and at other points during the Cold War. Currently, the 750 bases are located in 80 countries and colonies around the world, almost half the countries and colonies globally. And these bases have become both an important tool of U.S. imperialism, a tool of power and control and influence around the world, but also a symbol and reflection of the way in which U.S. military force has been a tool of economic elites, of corporate capitalist interests in particular, advancing U.S. corporate interests globally.
Now, shortly after the founding of the United States in the late 18th century, the United States found itself in armed conflict in North Africa. And I'm sure you know that the Marine hymn, from the halls of Montezuma, speaking of Mexico, to the shores of Tripoli, speaking of today's Libya, the Marine hymn in many ways exemplifies this conflict in North Africa. Talk to us about what insight you're able to share in your book about these wars in North Africa, which coincidentally involve wars against predominantly Muslim peoples.
Yes, probably the first of many wars against Muslim peoples and peoples in the greater Middle East. It is, again, a good example of the pattern that I was pointing to before. The Navy and Marines fighting in North Africa weren't just fighting for fighting's sake. They were there because they were essentially acting as the bodyguard for U.S. businesses that were trading in the Mediterranean. And taxes were being imposed on some of those U.S. businesses and their sailing vessels, sometimes being seized. And the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marines came to the aid of those U.S. businesses. And this, again, is a long-standing pattern where the U.S. military has served as a kind of bodyguard and advanced guard frequently, assisting U.S. businesses and showing us how the use of military force by the U.S. government has so frequently benefited a small business elite, and to an important extent as well, a political elite that is deeply intertwined with an economic elite, while the vast majority of people have not benefited from the now trillions upon trillions of dollars that have been poured into the U.S. war machine that has gone to the benefit, again, of a relatively small business and political and economic elite, while the vast majority of people in the United States have suffered because of the diversion of funds into the war machine, let alone the millions upon millions of other people around the world who've suffered as a result of the U.S. war machine and the wars that U.S. elites have led us into, the almost exclusively catastrophic wars.
Well, fast forward to 2023. Talk to us about AFRICOM, the Africa Command, which is the armed force of the United States military that focuses on Africa. Yeah,
so the U.S. military previously was involved in Africa, and the CIA, of course, has a long history of involvement in Africa throughout the Cold War. But in 2006, 2007, the George W. Bush administration established a dedicated command, part of the U.S. military, focused on Africa. And notably, the headquarters of the Africa Command are in Germany, which last I checked isn't part of Africa. And that's because none of the countries in Africa would accept the headquarters of the Africa Command on their territory. There was quite opposition among civil society groups, activists, others, and governments who wanted no part of this Africa Command. And I think it again is a good and, in my mind, sad example of the way in which U.S. foreign policy has been so deformed and so dominated by the U.S. military force and the U.S. military itself, to the exclusion, almost always, of diplomatic forms of engagement, political forms of engagement, cultural, educational forms of engagement. And, why is the United States military suddenly increasingly interested in Africa? The discovery of increasing supplies of gas and oil in both Western Africa, Eastern Africa, other parts of Africa, are a major part of the interest of the U.S. military and U.S. government elites who deployed U.S. forces into Africa. Meanwhile, you see China, of course, in particular, has also been increasingly interested in Africa, but it highlights the different approaches. And there's much to critique about the Chinese approach to its relationship with Africa. But the Chinese government has made strategic economic investments, built infrastructure, and invested in other ways around the continent. The United States has responded to the United States government, let me be clear, has responded to China's activity in Africa and the rise of China more broadly with military force by deploying troops and building an increasing number of U.S. military bases around the continent. Sometimes the U.S. military will say it only has one base in Africa. This is now completely debunked. And in fact, the U.S. military has released some of its own maps showing that in addition to a very large base in Djibouti, there are scores of mostly smaller, but not entirely smaller bases in places like Niger, Kenya, and far across to places like Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, other parts of West Africa, and really around the continent. And again, I think this is precisely the wrong direction that the United States should be from the one the United States should be taking, which is a foreign policy that should be dedicated not around building bases and deploying troops, but instead building up our diplomatic presence globally, our embassies and diplomats. This is part of course, the challenge that faces us, because we're not building bases and deploying diplomats by and large. We are continuing, the United States government is continuing to build up its bases and troops around the world, increasingly in not just in Africa, of course, as part of the buildup of U.S. military forces in Europe following Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
And then there's this hemisphere. We know that after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, there was the Bay and Pigs invasion a few years later, involving a subsidized U.S. force seeking to overthrow the regime, countless efforts to decapitate the leadership in Havana, support for so-called Contras in Nicaragua, and support for military regimes throughout the hemisphere. Talk to us about the U.S. role in war in this hemisphere in the Americas.
It's, of course, a long and bloody history, deadly history, that dates to at very least, the 19th century. Sometimes the people will say that the United States was no longer an empire after the War of 1898 and the acquisition of colonies in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. But indeed, that really began an especially intense period of U.S. invasions and wars and occupations of countries across Latin America that, of course, continued into well into the 20th century and into the 21st century, including the Contra Wars and wars supporting right-wing dictatorships in Central America that are, of course, directly tied to the flow of migrants into the United States from Central America, fleeing violence and instability that can be directly tied to the wars of the 1980s, as well as other forms of instability that, of course, have even more complicated roots. But the United States has, we're coming up on the anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine. U.S. leaders have claimed the entire hemisphere as its own and have treated it in borders as ones that could be violated at will, deploying military force into countries, again, almost exclusively in the interests and to support the activities of capitalist corporations. I will say that Latin America does offer one sort of model for U.S. engagement that is the kind of model we need to embrace now. And a brief period in U.S. history when the United States did not launch and was not engaged in war was toward the end of the 1930s, when President Roosevelt announced and engaged in his good neighbor policy, which was a policy of engagement with Latin American neighbors, not based around invading our neighbors, but instead around building up diplomatic forms of engagement and cooperation, economic, political, educational, cultural forms of engagement. And this kind of good neighbor policy really should be and can be something of a model for, I think, what U.S. foreign policy should look like globally, not just in Latin America. Again, a policy based around non-intervention in the affairs of other nations, around the sanctity of borders and not invading other nations, as you hear President Biden speak about frequently when talking about Russia and Putin, and around forms of engagement geared around negotiation, diplomacy, educational, political, economic, and forms of cooperation focused on the real threats facing us, beginning with the threat of global warming, climate change, global pandemics, poverty, and other forms of insecurity, rather than the foreign policy that U.S. leaders have pursued that's been so dominated by the deployment of U.S. military force with such disastrous, catastrophic effects.
Finally, David Vine, professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C., author of the book United States of War, A Global History of America's Endless Conflicts from Columbus to the Islamic State. I take it that but for the existence of an anti-war movement over the decades, that the United States would have been involved in many more wars than it has been. Is there any insight that you can share from your historical excavation as to how we can strengthen that anti-war movement?
So that's a key question. We need to, of course, strengthen anti-war forces and an anti-war movement in this country. And it's important to point out that there's nothing inevitable about the United States being a United States of war, being a country defined by its history of war, by a profoundly militarized society, by an economy dominated by a permanent war infrastructure. The United States has avoided wars in the past, and often because people spoke out and rejected war as an answer. And we need to ensure that people increasingly speak out, because my greatest fear right now, in addition to continuing a range of wars in places, including Africa, in places like Somalia and Yemen, where the United States is still involved in the Saudi and UAE-led war, The United States, my greatest fear is headed toward a conflict, a war with China, which could be catastrophic for all of humanity. Any conflict, any military clash between the United States and China could very easily spiral out of control and become a nuclear war between the two most powerful countries on Earth that could literally endanger human existence on Earth. Any nuclear war between China and the United States could kill literally billions of people and again, endanger all of human existence on Earth. This should scare the hell out of all of us. And I think it's a moment where we all need to be asking ourselves, do we want a war with China? Because that's where a lot of U.S. leaders are taking us. There are a growing number of really frightening U.S. military leaders and other government leaders who assume a war with China is inevitable. And again, wars are never inevitable. And the fact that some leaders, so-called leaders, can contemplate a war between the United States and China is truly frightening, again, because of the human consequences that any military clash between the two most powerful countries on Earth would mean for people in the United States and China and in the across East Asia. And this is absolutely what we must prevent, especially because of, who is benefiting from this kind of fear-mongering that's ratcheting up tensions between the United States and China and actually making a war more likely. Largely, it's the folks in the military-industrial complex who are benefiting from this growing fear-mongering about China, in particular in the United States, and who are growing from the ratcheting up of tensions as the U.S. Congress plows more tens of billions of dollars every year into a military budget that now actually exceeds $1 trillion every year, including all the money that is plowed into the war machine. This, of course, is money that we are not investing in pressing human needs at home and around the world, all the while making our lives far more insecure because they are making a war with China, as well as other ongoing wars, possible or more likely. It's really a moment of great precarity and a moment when we need to find any and every way to build up anti-war, anti-militarist sentiment in this country and choose a profoundly different path, which I think we're people in the United States, it's clear to me, do not want war, are sick of war after more than 21 years of post 9/11 war on terror. People want to turn away from war. It's just a small elite, the so-called blob in Washington, D.C., group of political leaders, think tank types, and military leaders who are leading us toward a catastrophic future that we must find a way to turn away from.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Vine, Professor of Anthropology at American University. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Ditto.
This is Kenwan Congo Jr., calling from a prison camp behind enemy lines. Pennsylvania Senate Bill 135 gives parole eligibility to those who are serving life sentences. But of course, people are going to scream, wait, keep them locked up for public safety. That's because of the media, not the truth. The truth is, in countries like Norway and Germany, most imprisonment does not exceed 20 years, including for those convicted of murder. And their approach comes at no expense to public safety. In addition, researchers give us overwhelming evidence that people actually age out of crime. I also question the so-called danger of these individuals when I look at sentencing guidelines. Felony murder gives life without parole sentences to accomplices who did not know, and accidental deaths. Overall, life without parole sentences is not only an utter failure, it's also grossly unjust. To support Pennsylvania Bill 135, support CABI, which stands for Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration. Support the HRC, which stands for Human Rights Coalition. and support the ALC, Abolitionist Law Center. This is Kenwan Congo Jr. calling from a prison camp behind enemy lines. Thank y'all. All power to the people.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24, South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
From KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now, and with me on the line is Marco Wyss, Director of the Center for War and Diplomacy and Professor in International History and Security at Lancaster University in the UK, and author of the book Post-colonial Security, Britain, France, and West Africa's Cold War. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Wyss.
Thank you very much for having me, Gerald.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book, Post-colonial Security?
As such, there's a plethora of reasons, but I think there's a story perhaps I tell that will explain why. I was working in a non-history role as such. I was doing security studies in a previous job, still a university job. And I was working on peacekeeping in Africa, and notably France's post-colonial security role, and notably how France was the kingmaker in the 2011 post-electoral crisis in Côte d'Ivoire. And so I studied that. I visited the French military base, I interviewed people, various ambassadors on the spot. And sort of the conundrum for me was like, how can it be that so many decades after independence, France was still such a presence, in its former colonies and was dominating militarily and could be the kingmaker. So therefore, I thought, well, for my next project, I want to go back in time and sort of see when actually this bifurcation happened, when, what was the crossroads where it actually led to today's post-colonial security order. And for that, in order to make it more relevant, to compare it with Britain, because Britain, unlike France, had not such an interventionist approach, had largely militarily withdrawn, especially after the Cold War, but even before. And the intervention after the Cold War in Sierra Leone was rather the exception, confirming the rule. So therefore, I sort of went back in history and wanted really to find out, how can it be that there's such a huge discrepancy between the two major former colonial powers in Africa, whereas one is still there with a neo-imperial, neo-colonial agenda. Another one has largely withdrawn, other than some limited training in Kenya or so.
Mm-hmm. Now, as noted, you focus on Nigeria and Côte d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, in other words. But what of Ghana, a former British colony, and Guinea-Conakry, a former French colony? There was certainly U.S. hostility to Ghana. The U.S. was accused of being implicated in the February 1966 coup against Kwame Nkrumah. I assume that London was not displeased with that coup. And Guinea-Conakry, a former French colony, as suggested, was certainly opposed with hostility by France, up to and including, we're told, that upon independence, that France sought to destabilize that small West African country, stripping it of everything from toilets to typewriters. So does the invocation of Ghana and Guinea-Conakry in any way reflect on the thesis you're making in your book?
Yes, I mean, to some extent, perhaps if you allow me to briefly mention why I focused on Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria, and then I'll briefly bring in Guinea and, of course, Ghana. I mean, the first one is sort of, I think it's important with, many books having been written on, especially Ghana, to a lesser extent, Guinea-Conakry, but of course, there's the excellent work by Elizabeth Schmidt. There's less on actually sort of the Cold War role of the so-called conservative, moderate countries. And with Cote d'Ivoire being, like Nigeria, heavyweight in the region, I think they lent itself to actually being comparatively studied if I wanted to look at the post-colonial security roles of Britain and France. Now, interestingly, when we look on the one hand at Guinea is, of course, Sékou Touré, he was, of course, in the same trans-regional party as Houphouët-Boigny, but of course, different tendencies, but they knew each other relatively well. But unlike Houphouët-Boigny, who, was advocating the French community, Guinea-Conakry eventually went against the French community, against what de Gaulle wanted, and therefore this horrible, vindictive behavior by France, which you just mentioned. I mean, they really tried to, almost destroy, Guinea. And also they went to the United States and asked the United States not to support Guinea in any way, that they could not be an example of a former French colony becoming successfully independent without especially the support from France. So that was playing to some extent a role, and you can see clearly the opposition that you had between Houphouët-Boigny and Sékou Touré, which was of course about very different visions of what the future should hold and what independence would ultimately mean. This being said, however, their relations went so far back. So even though Houphouët-Boigny was apparently to some extent involved in destabilization activities against Guinea together with France later on, he always, renewed the dialogue eventually with Sékou Touré. Now, Ghana is, I think, very interesting because Ghana is something, if you fast forward now to 1967, to the Nigerian Civil War, what you have is Cote d'Ivoire supporting Biafra against federal Nigeria. But if we go back to the period of the First Nigerian Republic, it's fascinating how close Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, so the Nigerian Prime Minister, and Félix Houphouët-Boigny, the President of Cote d'Ivoire, are, because they have one key common denominator. And that common denominator is Kwame Nkrumah. They both fear the interventionist policies of Kwame Nkrumah. They both are very much against any Pan-African integrationist endeavors. And they support or are more in line with their former colonial powers, which means, of course, that contrasts very much with Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana. And Kwame Nkrumah, of course, he supports to some extent the Sanvi rebels within Cote d'Ivoire at the very beginning of Ivorian independence. And he also supports to some extent, though it's not proven to what extent, of course, some destabilizing forces within Nigeria. We don't know to what extent it's actually fabricated or not. And then, of course, there's the coup in Togo in 1963, which also plays on the fears of Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria. So it's very much this tension that Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria have with Ghana. It's not only at the sub-regional level, so actually the immediate sort of threat perception, it's at the regional level in terms of policy differences, but it's also at the Cold War level, especially once Kwame Nkrumah gets a bit closer to the Soviet bloc, even though never fully, of course, supports it. And the same, similarly with Sékou Touré's Guinea, but Sékou Touré, interestingly, was never considered a serious threat by Houphouët-Boigny or Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, or more generally, Abidjan and Lagos.
So you also discuss how the nation we then knew as West Germany challenged Britain in Nigeria, and Israel challenged France in Cote d'Ivoire. How so?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely fascinating. When I stumbled across this, I was impressed. It's one of these stories you wouldn't think it's possible without actually knowing that it exists. So anyway, so what happened was that, of course, the British, they had tried to formalize their defense relations and security relations with Nigeria. And they managed to do so, but they had to give in more and more. But but eventually they managed to enter into a defense agreement with Nigeria after independence. The problem was, however, Nigeria being a democracy, having an opposition, having a free press, there were a lot of outcries of trade unions against it, and also Kwame Nkrumah, who said his piece. And the problem was there, of course, that then the defense agreement was abrogated. But so Britain, their idea was, in abrogating it, was to actually throw Abu Bakr Tafawa Balewa a lifeline, so that he could, carry on with his government. So not that this opposition to this close connection with Britain would bring him down. But the idea would be to continue with close security relations at a more informal level. And Britain thought that in order to maintain their influence in Nigeria, they would work through military assistance. So Britain, of course, had built up the Nigerian armed forces, which until then had a navy and an army, but they did not have an air force. But so for Britain, it was almost obvious that it would be the Royal Air Force that would be establishing this Nigerian Air Force. The problem was, however, that the Nigerian Defense Minister, Muhammadu Ribadu, for him, it was an issue that he had to show that Nigeria was living up to its proclaimed policy of non-alignment, even though, of course, a very Western-oriented non-alignment. And therefore, he had to show that Nigeria would not only rely on the British for its military assistance. So therefore, he started shopping around India, Commonwealth country, and non-aligned, which of course was, very attractive. India would eventually end up, building up the Nigerian Defense Academy, also in the early 1960s. He went to Canada, a Commonwealth country, but not a leading Cold War country, not a superpower. And then he also went to Switzerland, Sweden, but also, of course, West Germany. And there, of course, one could say that, well, West Germany, why? It's also a Cold War power. It's on the front line of the Cold War. But for the Nigerians, their idea of non-alignment at the time was very much an anti-colonial. So it should be as little as possible the former colonial power. And if possible, not necessarily the Cold War superpower. So Germany offered a sort of a middle ground, which was interesting. And Germany, of course, was to some extent, it was a power that was in its own parallel Cold War with East Germany, because they both vied for recognition, allies in the United Nations. So getting the contract to build up the Nigerian Air Force was an ideal way for the Germans to become friendly with the Nigerians. And then, of course, you have economic interest. Nigeria being such a vast and populous country with a huge economic potential, everybody knew that already at the time. So, of course, for German businesses, it was attractive too. They also built a small armaments factory. And so Germany then came in. And interestingly, the Brits, they were not too panicked because, they were upset. They were sad almost. They were really disappointed, not angry. It was really disappointment and sadness almost, because they thought they had been very close. And it was almost a given for them. But ultimately, from a British perspective, was, well, as long as it's an allied country, it's a Western country, so it's fine. And so they tried to cling on to their military assistance with the Navy. Now, with the French, of course, and Israel, it's another story. So what you have, the French much more jealously guarded what they call their précaré, or translated hunting ground, which is, the kind of former Francophone, the former French West Africa, their former colonies and so on and so forth. And so they would not let anyone in, because their cooperation agreements in defense and military assistance that they signed with the former colonies, even though Houphouët-Boigny managed to sort of have quite tailored ones because he had a lot of leverage with the French by playing them quite a fair bit, but ultimately they had near exclusivity, the French. So that meant that it was much more difficult for a competitor to get into the Ivorian market for military assistance or defense. But the French at the time were relatively close to Israel. Of course, one should not forget that Israel, in military terms, had been largely equipped by the French by that time, early 60s, and they were quite close, they were relatively friendly, and the Ivorians wanted to build up a civic service. Now, they went to see the French first, but the French did not see any military potential. They thought it was a waste of money to build up a civic service, so they were not keen on that project. And then Conan Bani, the Ivorian defense minister, went to Israel, and he saw what they could offer in terms of technical assistance in building up the civic service, which would help with agriculture, but would also, of course, have ultimately a defense role to some extent. And once the French realized that when the Israelis built up this civic service, then also later a feminine civic service, les coopérants, so the kind of assistance personnel of France on the ground, grew increasingly upset because they thought it would encroach on their training of the Ivorian army, because it was, of course, related. So therefore, they pushed very much back, jealously. Even Israel, a relatively small and not, real competing country, the French tried to push them out as much as they could and very much reduced the Israeli role. And Israel then had to cling on to a relatively limited role in terms of the civic service, really just the civilian side of things. This was also easy for the French because Conan Bani, the defense minister, had in one of the many purges of Houphouët-Boigny ended up in prison by the sort of towards the mid-60s, was thrown into prison. So he being the pro-Israeli person in Abidjan, therefore this was an opportunity for the French to proactively roll back any Israeli influence.
I take it from what you've said thus far that there was not necessarily unhappiness in February 1966, unhappiness in Lagos or in Abidjan when Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown. I assume that that's true, but secondly, is there any evidence of Nigerian or Ivorian participation or assistance to the Ghanaian military that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think I could not find any evidence whatsoever. And I went in much detail through the archives of the organization that was headed by Jacques Faucard, who was, De Gaulle's man in Africa, of course, we're working heavily with intelligence and so on. I think I couldn't find any proof, and I don't think so, to be honest. And I also think that on the British side, even less so, because the British found arrangements and they were less preoccupied for as long as it wouldn't go fully against them. Now, when we look at Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire, interestingly, what you have is, of course, Nigeria was descending into chaos. And then you have the coup in January 1966 in Nigeria, which leads to the overthrow of the first Nigerian Republic, the prime minister being killed, the Sardauna of Sokoto being killed, the big leader of the Northern People's Congress, and a number of other people also being killed or deposed, and leading then to the first military government, which then, of course, you have another coup in July 66, then leading to the government of Yakubu Gowon, who would then be the federal Nigerian leader during the Civil War. But what I found fascinating, and that's the way I open my book actually, is that Nigeria is everybody knows it's becoming increasingly a mess. I think it's just a matter of time until the first Nigerian Republic ends, pretty much, until there's a coup or something of sorts, because tensions have been building up dramatically since 64. But at the time the coup happens in Nigeria, and there's a wave of other coups, you mentioned Ghana and elsewhere, of course. What happens in Abidjan at the same time is a meeting between Houphouët-Boigny and the French ambassador, where Houphouët-Boigny pleads with the French to stay in Port-Bouët next to Abidjan and maintain their military base. Because in 64, the French actually had wanted to planned to withdraw militarily from Côte d'Ivoire and reduce the amount of military bases. But Houphouët-Boigny, who over the time had signed over his actual own security and his regime security to the French through secret agreements, he thought he relied on for his security on this very French military presence in Abidjan. So he was pleading with the French to actually stay in Port-Bouët with their military base, and was using the example of the coup in Nigeria and, of course, elsewhere as an example why they should stay, in order that there would be stability and no coup against him, and he was their man in Africa. So that was the idea behind it, and it's a really, really interesting thing. And he even went on to say that had Abubakar Tafawa Balewa kept some British protection, he would still be alive. So I think that is the key dynamic that came out of it for me. It's not only this different understanding of the British and the French, but very much this different vision of the leaderships in Lagos and Abidjan.
Finally, Professor Wyss, author of the book Post-colonial Security, Britain, France, and West Africa's Cold War. how do you explain the continuation of France's neo-colonial empire in Africa versus the declining British role? Is it fair to suggest that Washington supplanted London as being a major force in former British colonies in West Africa? And as you respond, do you have any detail to add on any possible U.S. role in the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah in 1966?
Yeah, thank you. Let's briefly perhaps start slightly from a British and French perspective and then take what I think is the more crucial dynamic here or factor why you have such divergent post-colonial security roles between Britain and France. So firstly, of course, Africa was for British policy planners and strategists never as important as Africa was for French policymakers and strategists, right? With having a more Asian-oriented empire, with India being the jewel in the imperial crown and these kind of things. Now, of course, what you have is after the Second World War, for the first time, with Britain having actually used substantial manpower from Africa, Africa becomes more important temporarily. You have this third force idea by Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary, which is to mobilize African resources to rebuild the British Empire, to have a third force between the United States and the Soviet Union. That was something which was similar to French ideas, of course, slightly different, but even the French and the British consulted each other on this idea to revive their fortunes by relying on Africa. So there was this realization. Of course, this was swept to some extent under the carpet with the Atlantic turn and the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty and then organization and so on and so forth. But there was still this idea, and what you have, of course, after Suez, you have this divergence between Britain and France. Britain decides to fight not only the European Cold War, but the global Cold War with the United States, together with the United States, whereas France took as a lesson of Suez and the humiliation imposed pretty much by the Americans on them and the British, that they had to go more independently. And for that, Africa remained quite important. So this being said, Nigeria was very important temporarily, also after Suez and the Iraq Revolution in 1958, for the trans-African air route, which with difficulties in the East for Britain, that they could reach, of course, the empire east of Suez. Now, this being said, so you had, of course, first these divergences already happening then. But so France was much more reliant for its great power role or understanding of its great power role on Africa than Britain was. But Britain wanted to maintain a role, but Britain was thinking more informally, less confrontationally. And also Britain had left a legacy of, at least an initial legacy of sort of functioning democracies, at least the idea that there would be a democratic element, whereas in Côte d'Ivoire rapidly descended into an authoritarian one-party state de facto, right? But I think the ultimate game changer, other than the French having an unashamed neo-colonial, neo-imperial attitude, especially de Gaulle. I mean, it's absolutely unashamed. It's like decided that, look, this is our turf, no one touches it. That's the idea. I mean, that's how the French approach it at the time, and, you know, for not a number of generations. Whereas Britain was much more, it was about all we have to do is that they stay on the side of the West in the Cold War, or at least don't turn against us. But for France, that was not the issue. For France, it was no matter, it's as bad if they turn to the United States as if they turn to the Soviets. It's really this mindset, this French mindset, which is so different. But what was really, again, sorry, I sort of digress a bit, but the key thing here is also the African leaders themselves. Houphouët-Boigny had not even wanted independence. He only went for independence once the French community imploded when the Mali Federation received the go-ahead from de Gaulle, General Charles de Gaulle, for independence. But he had wanted to develop Côte d'Ivoire, under the protection of France, not having to deal with defense and security issues, actually being able to focus on economic and social development. Whereas in Nigeria, the leaders, they wanted to have independence, they wanted to build up the country, and that was also quite assisted by Britain. But especially, he was unchallenged, so he could pretty much do whatever he wanted, other than his regional allies in the Council of the Entente, some youngsters perhaps they had to deal with. But he could deal in a way with France like he wanted. And it was very much he who was in as much the driving force in this neo-colonial collusion as France was a driving force in this neo-colonial collusion. And I would say even more to some extent. And that then created a system that has persisted, over decades, and in some cases even until today. Whereas Britain then eventually agreeing, to play it more economically and perhaps being slightly pushed out, for as long as it's by the Americans, that was fine. But I think what's also important to see here, the Americans, after the Congo especially, but even before the Congo, the Americans did not care about Africa. And with Kennedy, they briefly cared about Africa, but only for the wrong reasons, which was, of course, to win Nkrumah back, win Sékou Touré back, and keep sort of the friendly countries friendly to the United States with all the modernization theory and the money that was invested in development. And then with Johnson again, there's not much interest in Africa. So, and especially then with the focus on Vietnam. So the United States is not really caring or concerned about Africa that much, and only is willing to get in if the former colonial power can't maintain a form of influence that keeps it in the West. So typically, in the French case, you have de Gaulle and Focard. They're all the time concerned that the Americans want to take Côte d'Ivoire or other former colonies away from them. But actually not. You read the American documents, they're very much, no. For as long as the French can handle it, we want the French to do it. We don't want to overextend ourselves. Africa is not our priority. It's a mess, and so on and so forth, or it can be a mess. And in the case of Nigeria, the United States only get more involved when the army training by the mid-1960s is supposed not to be with Britain, but the Nigerians approach the Americans. But as soon as the Nigerian civil war breaks out, you actually have the Americans say immediately, okay, Brits, you can do it again. And the advantage for the Brits at that moment is, of course, that there are in power in Lagos by that time again, Sandhurst, so the Royal Military Academy, trained Nigerians who are pro-British and actually want to get military assistance from Britain. Then, of course, it's another matter when Britain has domestic opposition that makes it more difficult to provide substantial military aid and so on and so forth. And so the Americans are not that interested, especially not by the mid-1960s. And I know there are works, especially by Ghanaian scholars I've come across when I was, a couple of years ago, once more in Accra, that there are claims that there was American involvement in the coup against Nkrumah. I myself haven't seen the evidence, the actual documents that would prove it, but it's something that we can't exclude it. It could have been the case. But then again, I'm insufficiently, I think, an expert on Ghana and Nkrumah to answer this question satisfactorily.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Marco Wyss, Director of the Center for War and Diplomacy and Professor in International History and Security at Lancaster University in the UK, author of the book Postcolonial Security, Britain, France, and West Africa's Cold War. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Pacifica, Los Angeles.
Thank you very much for having me and giving me this wonderful opportunity to talk about my book.
Thank you, sir.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, David Vine, Marco Wyss. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, and all those who made today's program possible. Thank you to our board op, Wendell. This program, as well as prior programs, can be reheard for the next 60 days. Go to kpfk.org, audio archives, scroll to Freedom Now. Signing off, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.